We're listening to the prosecution's closing statement, something that stuck with me. Unfortunately, AIDEN was in the way of this crossfire. Michael Bryant, I want to bring you in. You're a criminal defense attorney. Obviously, anytime you have a child under 2 years old who loses their life in such a tragic way, there's a lot of sympathy there. But did the prosecution fulfill their burden here as far as DNA evidence, forensic evidence, and positive identifications?
I mean, those are the big hurdles, but they aren't forgetting in this closing argument the very important foundation they have to lay. Remember, motive is not an element of the crime, but we need to know more about the gang connection, because you can't just leapfrog that and say, yeah, it was gang activity, let's go to the ID. You have to break down what the evidence was that established this was a gang-related shooting. Yes, the victim got in the way of that activity, but if you don't establish that foundation, the motive gets a little muddy and ID means nothing.
Exactly, and that's why we've seen the prosecution so focused on that fact, the rap lyrics. We just heard about the Facebook Live videos. All of those facts are putting together this puzzle, painting the picture of why this tragic event had to happen. We will be going back live into the courtroom where we're hearing the closing arguments now. Stick with us, though. We don't want to miss a second of this, but now we do have to go to a break, but we'll be back in the courtroom shortly.
This is Law and Crime.
We're watching the closing arguments by the prosecution in the tragic case of the death of a 22-month-old child in what the prosecution is saying was crossfire due to gang violence. Michael Bryant, we're watching the prosecutor put together the case for us in their closing. I think they're doing a pretty good job of leading us in the direction of what they intend to, what they look to prove during the trial. Now, there was a focus on this aspect of premeditation. Can you tell us what the prosecution needs in order to get a conviction for first-degree murder?
They need to prove that there was some malice aforethought, some intent to kill that was developed either briefly or over time. Hey, these are gangbangers. This is not a huge problem to get over, but the prosecutor did the right thing by laying it out. They had an intent to kill somebody, and really it doesn't matter to whom they were aiming that violence. Somebody was killed in the process, it's transferred intent, and you've got premeditation.
Right, so that's an interesting question, and some of our viewers have asked that because it's conceded by the prosecution that this child wasn't the intended victim, that he was just tragically in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then we see the prosecution looking at Facebook Live, the fact that they had a carjacked, a stolen vehicle, the windows were tinted, all of that leading to their conclusion of premeditation.
Right. Messages back and forth that we're going to get you. You know, you got one of ours, we're going to get one of yours. I mean, that's not a huge element to convince the jury exists, premeditation.
Right. And you're right. I think when you're talking about the fact that we're in this world of gangs, and that's what the prosecution focused on, the gang culture, they might not have too far to throw to get that over the, over the wall. So only time will tell. We're going to continue to go back into the courtroom to listen to the prosecution's closing arguments in the Hayes case. Listen. The prosecutors making a strong point in their closing arguments, talking about showing these visuals to the jury. We're seeing photographs that were taken from the defendant's phone, from Hayes' phone. One of those pictures referenced by the prosecutor, that Hayes had a photograph of what he called his work, the body of the victim, a 22-month-old child. Michael, this is the type of evidence that just is always going to stick with the jury. And the prosecutor really made that point and drove it home by showing these visuals in the courtroom.
Oh, yeah. I mean, show and tell is always much better than just going on and on. But photos like that found on one of the defendant's phones. Now, if it hadn't been accompanied by any language, it was just a picture, I could argue for the defense that, he's a member of the community, therefore it was another member of the community that was killed, this young 22-month-old kid. But to add the words, my work, or to reference it in a way that he was proud, I mean, come on, dude. I mean, you're writing your own death warrant there. Come on.
Absolutely unbelievable, and so hard for the average person to understand how that would ever be something you would want to claim credit for. And that brings us back to what the prosecution was doing during the trial, explaining the gang culture, essentially.
Most folks, thankfully, don't understand it. It is a way of life and a way of death.
Absolutely, and that was a point that the prosecution brought up, right? No snitching, that code of silence, a big part of how some witnesses weren't coming forward, weren't being cooperative, and how that all fits in with basically the code of the streets.
Right.
So
and it was actually very encouraging to see some folks step out of that mold and risk injury or death by speaking up. So
Absolutely.
that's actually a good thing.
that we got some evidence because of that we might not normally have had. We're going to go back live to the courtroom. Do not go anywhere. Right now, we are going to a break. We're watching the prosecution's closing argument in the Hayes case. Michael Bryant, you're here with me. We've been watching this. I think the prosecution is doing a really good job of putting together the pieces, but we have been getting a lot of questions. Interestingly enough, the two defendants in this case, while the trial's taking place together, there's two different juries. So this relates to Hayes only. Can you explain why that might happen?
That is the legal word for that is wacky. That's you've got two distinct juries sitting in the same courtroom. That doesn't happen very often. Remember, the reason you might do this is supposed to be judicial economy. You would see severance or bifurcation more often than this. You'll see two totally separate trials, totally separate defendants. Well, this court decided for some reason that we're going to save some money. We're going to put on one trial. We're going to have two jury boxes, and you're going to have to ferret out which is applied to you and which is applied to the other jury. And this is going to be Groundhog Day tomorrow because the second jury is going to get the same spiel.
Right, because we're going to have completely separate closing arguments, maybe the facts tweaked a little bit.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. Yeah.
But very, very similar because, as you and I were talking about during the break, the actual facts, the foundational facts of the case that the prosecution is using to prove the case are going to be the same.
Right.
So it is a very interesting fact that we have two juries here. And we are going to be back live in the courtroom for the Hayes portion of the trial after this break. Wow, we were watching the prosecution's closing argument in the Hayes case. The prosecutor really did a great job of laying out the case for the jury. Michael, one thing we were speaking about during the break was when the prosecutor went through the different elements of the charges. We've got, murder, we've got a non-intentional murder, we've got manslaughter, lesser included offenses. Now, we were saying we're not sure if maybe the jury might have been a bit confused by the examples that the prosecution was giving. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think giving examples is a great idea because you want to help them visualize what these strange words mean. I don't understand. He talked about manslaughter in the context of really sort of a mistake. Like I meant to just brandish a gun at my friend and scare him by shooting over his head, but it hit him and killed him. Wasn't the idea originally. I think a juror might look at that and go, well, isn't that what happened here? Wasn't there an intent to kill Reginald and somehow the 22-month-old Aiden was killed instead? I don't know if that example helped the prosecution or hurt the prosecution.
I agree with you because when I heard it, I thought the same thing. And we had questions. Just our chatters were asking about, well, look, do you have to, or did the defendant have to mean to shoot Aiden in order for this to be an intentional murder? You very articulately explained that that's not the case. Can you tell our viewers about that?
Right. That's this concept called transferred intent. If you have the intent to kill somebody and by happenstance another person is killed, the intent to kill person A transfers to person B. The law will still hold you to that higher level of culpability because it seems right. You were trying to kill somebody. The fact that somebody else got in the way should not be a benefit to the person who shot them.
Right, and that's kind of the common sense explanation, which I'm not sure the prosecutor really got that across. But as you said, those examples can help the jury to understand what they're looking for when they get the charging instructions, which, hey, let's face it, it's filled with your legalese, and it's not that easy of a concept to understand. Again, and we talked about this a little before, there was a big focus by the prosecutor on the premeditation aspect, pointing to a lot of facts, for instance, a stolen car, tinted windows, the amount of the shots. Do you think that there's enough here to show premeditated murder?
I think there is, yeah, I think there is. Not just the timeline, but the intent that was displayed through the text messages, through the actions of the defendants. They were planning to kill Reginald, okay? That didn't work out. They killed somebody else, but the premeditation to kill is very clear.
Right. Now, what do you make of the photos? because that was had a lot of impact, at least in my eyes, to see what the prosecution was putting up on that board to lead the jury through their closing. What did you make of that?
Again, any visuals are a great thing in any phase of a trial, because you start over time to kind of lose people. You know, you want to give them something to focus on. So these are photos of the defendants in actions that look kind of gang-like. You know, they're gang-related activities and videos and music and signs. You know, anything you can do to tie them to that gang concept, and therefore the gang mentality, and therefore the gang intent to kill somebody else. Good for you, prosecutor.
Yeah, well, we'll see how the jury comes out on this one. We do expect that the defense will put on their closing argument in the Hayes case. Again, we're at two different juries here, so we're only focused on defendant Hayes at this moment. But right now, the court is on a brief recess, so let's review some of the facts of this case from the beginning. But stick with us, because we're going to be live in the courtroom later this afternoon.
Only 22 months old, baby Aiden McClendon's life was taken in a flash. Aiden's mother, Tamisha Brown, became emotional as she recounted on the stand what she saw from inside a car with her baby boy the night he died.
It was the one guy that I saw in the back seat, and then Harry Hayes.
You have two shooters. Who was he in that car?
He was in the back passenger side. He was the one that was actually leaning out of the car.
Okay.
Harry, that's the person that was in the back seat.
Okay. Shooting a gun?
Yes.
And did you write a statement on that photograph memorializing?
Yes.
And what was that?
He shot and killed my baby.
Kwame Richardson and Henry Lee Hayes are now on trial for the little boy's murder. Prosecutors say the suspects participated in a drive-by shooting, which led to the unintentional death of the one-year-old. Investigators believe a gang conflict is to blame. Jurors were shown a music video filmed by the gang that both defendants were allegedly a part of. Prosecutors believe the intended target and cousin of baby Aiden was affiliated with the rival group. Both defendants now facing charges of second-degree murder, 2 charges of attempted first-degree murder, discharging a firearm from a vehicle, and shooting or throwing deadly missiles. For Law and Crime, I'm Dan Abrams.
We're just watching some information about the case that we have been live in the courtroom, just heard the prosecution's closing arguments in this case. Now, this is the case of a 22-month-old child who, in just a tragic turn of events, got caught up in CROSSFIRE, which the prosecution says was gang-related. Right now, the court is on a 10-minute break, and we anticipate that Hayes, one of the defendant's attorneys, will be doing his closing argument, and then that will be followed by the prosecution's rebuttal if we have time in the courtroom today. Michael, so we were going through and watching the prosecution's closing arguments, and we're actually going to review some of that while the court is on this break. But I do think that they did a very good job of tying together the gang-related activity, because let's not forget, it was fragmented pieces, right? I mean, we have the videos online, we have the rap lyrics, we have tattoos. How does that all fit together in the mind of the jury?
And it's important to remember, you know, things don't always unfold in a trial the way that you need them to. It's not Law and Order, 30 minutes of the trial, 30 minutes of the apprehension. It can be all over the place. And so this closing argument is the perfect opportunity for the prosecution to stitch all those things together. And I think they did a great job. What I think sometimes is interesting, too, is what you don't hear. What did they not talk a lot about? And what he brushed over very quickly was the lack of forensics. This is not a forensics, in fact, the forensics expert was on to say what they didn't have for the most part. No, we didn't have any fingerprints, not a lot of DNA. And the reason is the prosecution puts that out there to diffuse any defense argument. When the defense comes up and says, look, they don't have DNA, they don't have fingerprints, my guy's nowhere near the place. Well, this prosecutor said those were not big deals. You know, we brought up the fact that there was not a lot of forensics and it'd be great to have, but we don't need it here. Here's what we've got.
Right. Well, that's actually such a good point. You're right. What was missing from that closing? And absolutely, that's what the defense has been capitalizing on, right? They've said that you don't have the forensic evidence to really tie the defendants to this case, and that you're not going to be able to fulfill your burden. But I have a question for you as a trial attorney. What about the positive identification by the mother? Now, of course, the defense is saying hey, not so fast. It was person was wearing a mask, only 3 seconds. It wasn't so clear. It's questionable. Do you think that is something that's going to stick with the jurors when they're deliberating?
It's a tough call because remember, you've got the mom. I mean, can you have a more emotional witness? No. But does that mean what she had to say was somehow wrong? 3 seconds, as the prosecution pointed out, is plenty of time to see and recognize and then remember. So I don't have a problem with that. I think the defense has to focus on the emotion of the moment. She could have identified any generic guy hanging out a car shooting a gun in her child's direction.
Right, and that's what the defense was trying to say. They were trying to say, hey, look, this really isn't gang culture. There are other people outside of gangs that listen to rap music and post these types of videos and whatnot. So the defense was focused on that, and I thought the prosecution did a good job of talking about just how long 3 seconds is. So that will hopefully be something that we're going to hear more about and see with the jury. Now, we're going to go to a break, but when we get back, we're going to break down the prosecution's closing while we wait for court to come back in session. The defense trying to raise that reasonable doubt, poking holes in the prosecution's theory of the case, focused on exactly what we thought, which they set forth in their roadmap, the defense right from the get-go, the lack of forensic evidence, of faulty or potentially questionable identification, and just the fact that this all happened so fast. Michael, let's talk a little bit about this because especially with the identification. So we learned right here, the defense reiterated that the identification of the shooter at the time by the mother was a light complexion African-American male. What do you make of that? This is a little questionable.
Well, it's pretty vague, obviously, and light-skinned is very subjective. I mean, I don't know if you look at the two defendants, I don't know if their skin tone would be the first thing you might recognize if you really see them. Both very unique hairstyles that might have been something you would recognize and list as an ID. So when the defense has done such a great job at challenging this identification, he's pointed out that the ID was through a rear view mirror focused through the back window of the car, which had, among other things, rear defroster type elements might further obscure her view. He's done a great job of saying she didn't see my guy, and that's the bottom line.
Right, and another piece of this, which we just heard the defense reiterate right now, do you know how fast this happened? That this was something, there's a firefight, that this was a pretty quick instance.
Oh yeah, and we're talking about a horrified mother who at the moment probably doesn't know what's going on, but her child is certainly in danger, if nothing else. And that taints her observation as well.
Absolutely, because when you're in that moment, when you're scared and in the midst of this firefight, you have 3 seconds to look at somebody, that's awfully tricky. So only time will tell what the jury's going to do. Make sure to join us back here at Law and Crime tomorrow for more live courtroom activity.